Hello everybody, welcome back to the latest episode of the Telegraph Rugby Podcast. What a weekend, especially at Twickenham, where I think the best way to describe it was a bit of a massacre. I'm Ben Coles and I'm joined in the studio by Charlie Morgan. Hi Charlie.
Hello Colesy.
And I'm joined virtually by Charles Richardson. Hello Charles.
Hello everybody.
Charles, you were up in Edinburgh, I believe. How was your trip up there? Was that fun?
Yeah, it was glorious. The weather was delightful on Saturday and it wasn't too bad on Sunday, despite the very ropey forecast. And we had a cracker of a game yesterday. Scotland, obviously, which we'll come on to. Scotland, obviously, excellent in the first half, but then Ireland inevitably gripped them in their vice in the second half and were comfortable winners in the end.
Ireland, despite playing with seemingly every member of their pack getting injured inside the first half, which is quite impressive.
Yeah. I mean, who knew Josh van der Fleer could throw into a line-out like that? I think Scotland let them off the hook a little bit, but it was still mightily impressive.
Was he Van der flying them in at the line-out? Is that what you...
Yeah, he was, yeah.
Okay, sorry, it's terrible. Charlie, we were at Twickenham, which was, good in some ways if you like rugby, and then not so great if you like England, was it?
A treat watching France, a treat watching a side that were clearly fired up with some exceptional individual players who all kind of turned up. And do you know what? It was one of those, I had a feeling, I'm allowed to kind of admit it now, I can't remember how deep I went into it in the podcast before, but I thought England might nick this. I thought they had 2 weeks building up to it, and I thought they could could stay in the fight and be there long enough to win it with a home crowd kind of winning them over the line if they were really precise with a lot of things that they did. That went out the window. I went out the window, I remember kind of getting the escalator up to the press box and looking at the team sheets and going, gee, France look a bit good with Dante back in there, and that back row looks pretty tasty as well. And geez, it unravelled very quickly. An early try when it is forecast to team it down after 20 minutes of the game is always pretty handy, but the way France kind of kept the foot on the throat was impressive. A World Cup statement.
You weren't the only one who felt that way, because when we heard from all the players and the coaches afterwards from England's side, they had been quite confident that they would be able to get a result, and we'll get into the horror of it and I guess the beauty of it as well, because France really did play some cracking stuff. I mean, but firstly, guys, if I can just ask you for a quick highlight from the weekend. Charles, I will come to you first. What was your favourite bit of play?
Well, in keeping with the fact that I was at Murrayfield yesterday, I suppose I should pick something or someone from Murrayfield, and I will go with Matt Hansen. Matt Hansen's second half performance, at least. Solid in the first half, barely put a foot wrong, and obviously finished his try very well. But in the second half, he was an absolute joy to watch and verging on unstoppable. He brilliantly leapt for the box kick for that low try in the corner that put them ahead, and then putting in Jack Conan for Ireland's final try, their third try. It just looked like there was nothing on. He's for a winger, he's just got this wonderful sort of awareness and knowledge of his peripheries, and ball in two hands, sucked in Van der Merwe, created space where it didn't look like there was any, and Conan, the number 8, went in virtually untouched. Really, Van der Merwe was never ever going to be able to recover, and I was in awe. Really, he's whisper it quietly. He's with the ball in two hands. He's a little bit of a campo about him.
I mean, but that's a good reference, because Australian supporters must be watching him playing for Ireland and tearing it up and thinking, "What on earth have we done?" Because he's been performing so well. Charlie, if I swivel my chair towards you, what was your highlight?
I think you know it. You're right next to me for it. So much to like about the Ireland performance, and looking forward to getting stuck into that later. But Antoine Dupont's left-footed 50-22 was mesmerising, partly because clearly England came with a plan to kind of nullify France's kicking game and get on top in that area. But so for him to mug them off so comprehensively, with just a sublime piece of skill, the deception with how he twisted his body, and then the strike itself, it almost happened. We're clearly so privileged where we get to sit for these games, so you can see it, and you've got a great view of it all playing out in front of you. But yeah, awesome.
It really was. For those of you familiar with the the gif of Thierry Henry and Jamie Carragher when someone got sacked live on Sky Sports a few years ago, where Henry sort of turns to Carragher with a shocked face and puts his leg on Carragher's knee, and then Carragher just looks at the camera going...
It was Brendan Rodgers, wasn't
sort of, what was that? Was it Brendan Rodgers?
Yeah.
It was essentially like that between me and Charlie, because I looked at Charlie and he was just looking at me like mouth agape at what had just happened. It was incredible moment. That was probably my favourite moment. But for variety, I'll go with Rhys Webb's performance for Wales getting player of the match, because that really sort of came from left field, sort of the way he sort of came into the team and completely dominated the game. I mean, brilliant box kick to set up Rio Dyer's try, had the break for Talipo Faletau's try. Just really interesting to see a player like that roll back the years and play so well.
Always looks like he's super happy, super just relishing playing for Wales as well, which is really nice in this cynical time.
That is a lovely lead-in to the first big discussion of the day. England against France. Okay, let's get into it. Right then, Charlie, I'll start with a very simple question, and we're then going to talk about it for about 15 minutes. Where did it all go wrong for England, do you think?
There's a few entry points here, aren't there? We often kind of have a situation where a team's preparation, and it can be as trivial as something like a load of drop passes going down in the warm-up or whatever, and then that never seems to have there never seems to be a connection maybe between that and the performance. But it was a weird fortnight lead up to this game, wasn't it? With Marcus Smith going back to Harlequins, and then it becoming with Gab Mayers breaking the story that he was going to start in the game. Always felt like an odd decision that jarred with what had gone before, as far as other coaches. When you get released to your club, we were kind of conditioned to think that was going to be it for Marcus Smith's chances for, if not playing, then certainly starting. But that came to pass. That was kind of becoming more and more clear towards the end of last week. Then he did. So you had that build up going into it. We've subsequently learned, I think it's been reported by the BBC, that Courtney Laws was potentially going to start as well. He was ruled out with a shoulder injury on the Tuesday, I think. So a little bit of disruption by England, but you still thought, they're getting better. They're getting better. The hallmark of a Steve Borthwick side is that they'll be tough. They'll be deliberate. From the very first ruck of the game, you remember what happened? There was a France turnover. There were 6 England players on the floor, including Jack Van Poortvliet, trapped into the ruck by one of his own players, including Carl Sinclair, who's taken out by Paul Willemse, who tackled Freddie Stewart. And France should have scored within 40 seconds. Cyril Baille, who's normally a fantastic decision maker on the ball, didn't make use of a big overlap outside of him. But it took 2 minutes, and they scored from another counter attack, because there was a poor kick in there from Van Poortvliet, and just every aspect of the game that had seemed so solid and had seemed like it was progressing against Wales, albeit slowly, fell apart in a really alarming way. And Owen Farrell made the point afterwards, didn't he, Ben? You were in the huddle with him, that you can't really question the intent of players, and I agree with that to a certain point. But England looked meek, and that's what will hurt Steve Borthwick the most, because he's renowned for his detail. He's renowned for kind of planning up to these fixtures and making sure that a lot of these strategies are in place. It was hard afterwards when England was saying our plan didn't work. It's tempting to say, sort of, can you please just expand a little bit on what you were trying to do, because that wasn't really clear. There were a few quick line-outs which suggested that they wanted to run France off their feet. But by the end of the game, by the end of the first half, and then by the end of the game, they looked gassed twice.
They also mauled more. They also mauled more than they had done in the first 3-4 games, I think, which also seems surprising, considering they'd spoken in the week about how big this French pack was, how muscular and aggressive and abrasive this French pack was. And I know the thinking might have been to sort of tie them in, but I don't understand why they didn't revert to what they were doing against Scotland and a bit more against Italy, whereby they were dummy mauling at these lineouts to hold that pack in and then playing quickly. I don't know. It just seemed it did seem a little bit muddled. Having said that, just obviously I watched it on the television because I was in Edinburgh, but I think the context is surely that is one of, if not the greatest French performance of all time. I mean, to away from home, to go and completely annihilate really one of their biggest rivals, who hadn't been playing too badly up to that game, was quite phenomenal. And being kind, I think you have to put this down to an off day for England, and that it's not part of a deeper malaise. This is not a pattern. We didn't sit here last week and say that it had been building to this and that we all saw this coming. This came out of the blue, if you will.
Oh, I like that a lot. I just on the. It feels a bit weird to sort of focus so much on one ruck in particular, but it did. The first ruck did sort of highlight so many issues with the game, because JVP sort of just gets sucked into that ruck. He sort of trips over Valencia, and then I think he's got a Toja and a couple of other forwards sort of sucking him in, and then Fuku makes the easy steal. But it just felt like England felt, in their deliberate attempt to be as physical as possible and to try and match France, they were just really ragged. Like, you had Lewis Ludlam conceding a couple of breakdown penalties in the first 40 minutes for going off his feet and for coming in at the side. You could tell that they'd been revved up by whoever in the dressing room, Ellis Genge, Richard Cockrell, whoever it was, to go out there and show France what they were about. And actually, it was sort of misplaced aggression. They couldn't get the power that they needed at the breakdown in the contact area, and actually they were just too ragged. Whereas on the other side, you had Gregory Aldrit absolutely steamrolling Freddie Stewart with that one carry, and that sort of set the tone actually for what was to come.
Yeah, there was just a focus to how ferocious France were. It was really impressive. One thing I failed to mention earlier was that I don't think I'd really grasped how much this meant to France. I know they sort of, as we'd highlighted, they'd been not drifting a little bit because they were still winning in the autumn, but their performances had probably dipped a bit, it was fair to say, and then Ireland were fantastic against them, weren't they? Francois Crowe said afterwards that that the side had been stung by that criticism after the Ireland game. And another thing is the history. Charles, you did a piece on how it was the last time that they'd won at Twickenham against England was in 2005, and that Crowe said that that history was a real inspiration for them, and you could tell that there was a real focus to them. And just to make this point more widely, and we seem to have made it kind of every time on during the Six Nations, but the Six Nations has, again, to reiterate, felt like a Six Nations of two divisions where you've got teams that have moved throughout this World Cup cycle. And this was a point that Steve Borthwick made afterwards. And this was really where you saw how much momentum and how much cohesion France have built up since 2019, and how far England have got to make that up. And I don't think they're 40... This is one of the stupid things, like adding 2 wickets on when you're playing cricket or whatever, but I don't think they're 43 points worse than France. I think if they play that fixture again, they get far closer. However, I think things can unravel when you haven't got that confidence and you haven't got that cohesion, and England are reaching for that.
A couple of points just on that. The best stat that I can give you about 2005 is that when France won that game in 2005 in the 05 Six Nations, Ollie Chesham was 4 years old. And he started, of course, on Saturday in the second round.
Started every game?
No. Yeah, in the under-5 Six Nations. Just on a more sort of serious note, 2019, obviously Fabien Galtier in that World Cup, Fabien Galtier was not the head coach of France, but he shadowed the team. He shadowed the team at the tournament. And now look where that sort of groundwork has got them. So this has been a long time coming. This has been a long time building. And, what might have been for England and the RFU, because six months ago, you would have said that the plan all along was for Steve Borthwick to potentially shadow Eddie Jones at the 2023 World Cup and then go on to build for 2025. And now it just looks like a complete mess in comparison to what's happened over on the other side of the channel. They've shown us up, really, France. They've always been the sort of incompetent ones with the style, but potentially not the organisation and the logistics. And now they've got the style, the organisation, and the logistics. And England are playing second fiddle in all stakes, really.
I'd agree with that. But it takes lots to deliver on all of those things, doesn't it, Charles? And the performance, as you've rightly highlighted, was special. Even with that in mind, it was sort of special, but no fluke. Like as in, I think we were sort of waiting for France after
Charles, I don't know if you've said this already. I think we were sort of waiting for them after a bit of a slump in the autumn, and not an amazing string of performances so far in this Six Nations to blow the doors off a game, and that's exactly what they did. I think with England, there was so much talk about Smith and Farrell last week that actually it became kind of irrelevant. In fact, it became completely irrelevant because
absolutely
England had no platform for Smith to work, and actually, not that Smith can't play in the rain, of course he can, but the weather at Twickenham was so bad that you sort of thought, actually, this whole idea that you want to play at pace, and they spoke about that so much on Thursday at Pennyhill Park before, when the team was announced, and how tempo was going to be key, ruck speed was going to be key. Borthwick was saying, we haven't hit our 80-minute target for ruck speed yet at all in this tournament, and sort of hinting like, this has to happen today. Well, I mean, it didn't. I think because of that, the Smith selection turned out to be not even a disaster. It was just kind of, it was barely a footnote in the whole story of the game.
Yeah, I mean, I find the criticism of the English halfbacks, slightly misplaced, really. In fact, not slightly misplaced, completely misplaced. To play at pace, it's not about just picking and selecting quick players. The pack were dismantled in all areas. There was one good scrum in the second half where France had just switched their tight heads. That was, in terms of plus points for the English pack, aside from a fairly decent individual performance from Maro Itoje, that was it, really. And how could you possibly be expected as a scrum half and as a fly half to conjure anything when the 8 blokes in front of you are being dismantled to such a violent degree that the English forwards were on Saturday? It's slightly short memories with regard to Jack Van Poortvliet as well, because when he made his debut in Australia and when he was coming off the bench in that Test series, he brought pace, he brought zip off the bench, and he looked excellent. Now, I don't know if that's just a general theme about scrum halves coming off the bench, because I agree that Alex Mitchell has brought some of that as well. But is that just a thing of scrum halves coming off the bench and looking to increase the tempo, and it being more of a sort of, I don't know, a conscious, active thing that they're trying to do? Whereas from the start of the game, maybe there isn't that conscious, active decision making in the brain of the scrum half. I'm not sure, but as I say, I think that certainly Alex Mitchell has brought tempo, but so did Jack Van Poortvliet off the bench in Australia.
Yeah, that's always so difficult to gauge, isn't it? I remember Dan Robson coming on and making similar kind of similarly changing the tempo during kind of his time with England under Jones. I totally agree on 2 points there. The one that Itoje was among the kind of more defiant figures. He won I think he won at least 3 turnovers over the course of the game. I've seen his performance criticised. I thought he and Freddie Stewart were 2 of the very few to kind of emerge with their reputations from it. One point I will make, I think we're going to just go to Owen Farrell's quotes after this, but I thought in his introduction immediately brought a little bit of clarity, so he could talk about the 10 debate not being irrelevant, and it was, given how inferior England's forwards were, but Farrell's organisation definitely made a difference. So whether that is Marcus Smith not being as assertive, whether that's Henry Slade not being as assertive, I think that's a question that will have to be looked into too.
Charlie, you've hinted at it there. Let's hear from Owen Farrell now and hear what he had to make of probably frustratingly having to watch the game from the bench for a large part of the game.
I'm not going into too much detail, to be honest, at the minute. Obviously, the result and the scorelines is hugely disappointing for us, and it's never nice. Most of the people in that room have been through it at some stage. Not normally with England. Well, definitely not normally with England. But I guess the thing is for us is nothing really changes. We've got to improve. This will make us have a good look at ourselves.
That was Owen Farrell trying to make sense of what happened at Twickenham. I think I want to focus on France, because otherwise we're going to get lost in sort of England issues, and we'll come back to further stuff with England down the line. So let's just talk, Charles. I'll come to you first. Particularly, I think about the return of Jonathan Donty at inside centre, which just made Quite an extraordinary change to France's level of performance, considering he is one player, but he just added so much on both sides of the ball, didn't he?
Yeah, absolutely. And we've been saying it all tournament, to be honest. We've been saying how much of a loss is Danty to them, and Saturday proved it. 6 out of 10 in L'Équipe player ratings, Jonathan Danty. If anything,
must try harder.
I was going to say, if anything, he's been over complimented for the history of L'Équipe. But he was fabulous. He gives them direction in midfield. He worries defenders. He worries defenders in a way that Mofana at 12 doesn't quite yet. I'm sure Mofana has lots of potential, and he might in the future, and they might decide that his best position isn't actually at 12. They've played him on the wing. I think he's played at 13 for France. He certainly played at 13 for Bordeaux. But Danty coming back in, it scared England. It clearly scared England because they had Manu Tuilagi playing that role in training prep, so they clearly had an eye on Danty. And once you've got 2 or 3 players having an eye on Danty, it's amazing how much other space there is for everybody else to exploit. And when these French players, especially the forwards, are so intelligent that they are able to exploit that and profit from that in an instant. Flamand, Olivon combining beautifully for that first try, and as you've already touched on, Colsey. What a day Gregory Aldrit picked to come back into form after sort of 6 or 7 months in the wilderness. Really, he'd been sort of meandering a little bit, if that's not too much of an impolite thing to say. But he wasn't meandering on Saturday, anything but.
I want to see the Sean Edwards hype talk pre-match. I want to know what was said. I want dressing room footage, because they came out red hot and they wanted it. And Aldrit and Crowe and Charles Olivon and Flamand, they were just wicked. They were so good.
He writes down a number, doesn't he, of the Sean Edwards, of the amount of points he thinks that his side should concede in the day. I wonder what he wrote down. I reckon 13. So I reckon he was under par. But no, on going back to this one ruck, and we're talking about it quite a lot, but Paul Willemse makes the tackle on Stewart, and as saying, he sort of rolls into to impede a load of England clearers, and Ellis Ganger was fuming with that and was kind of in Ben O'Keefe's ear about that.
Willemse was knackered, mate. It was 30 seconds into the game. He was so tired. He just had to lie there.
He's super clever. I'm sure he did that on purpose.
Yeah,
I put a clip on Twitter, and people are kind of questioning whether it was, but I'm sure it was. But the jackal threat there was Danty. And this is what the thing is about this French side. They've got these fantastic individuals, but over this 4-year period, they've learned how their strengths really complement one another. So, Ntamak is actually he's a really interesting case, because he's sort of this quiet facilitator. And I actually saw France fans getting a bit annoyed sort of with his kind of those grubbers into the 22 that are really kind of were quite skiddy and difficult to navigate for England's backfield defence. So interesting to see that, because every time you're watching that, thinking about how England are going to deal with it, it's not easy, and you're thinking, God, the chase is coming on. The next ruck is going to be really, really hardly contested by these fantastic jackalers they've got. That back row, Colsey, I think you've done a piece on the heft problem, or the perception of a heft problem England might have. England were 5 kilos heavier, as Charles, you pointed out at the time, according to the graphic that ITV Sport showed. It's just the balance of that France pack for me. Is the fact that you've got Willemse as a specialist tight headlock who's helping out the front rows at the scrum, and he's that mobile lifter in the line-out. But the rest of that back 5, rangy, athletic, skillful guys who are covering so much room, who are so comfortable on the ball and moving the ball. They're just a fantastic team.
Let's hear from one of the players involved in that physical effort who really shone. Francois Crowe, he spoke to us afterwards.
Maybe because the physicality wasn't good against Ireland, and the French media talk a lot about this. So when you're a player and the media talk to you about this, you really want to show it's not the truth, and you really want to show we are good physically. So tonight maybe we show a better image of French rugby.
We were told post-match that there weren't any French players available that spoke English, but I think you can agree that Francois Crow's English is quite good.
Credit James Wild, Planet Rugby, for the assist. He just sort of went over, and I know his English is okay because I've done a couple of interviews with him.
Certainly better than our French, apart from Charles, actually. Sorry, Charles, as soon as I said that, I realised that might be offensive to you.
Why was Thibaut Flamand not available?
That would be
already done TV,
a question
maybe?
for someone else. Yeah, he did do TV on Intermac before we move on. Quite an interesting week for him because Jalibert got the knock in training, didn't he? And there's been all that chatter sort of in the background about should it be Intermac, should they change and have a look at Jalibert? And then the week that Jalibert gets the knock, he sort of quietly had a stormer because it was his sort of tap back to Flamand for Flamand's second try. But also what I really loved was it his sort of outrageous out the back pass to Gael Fiki before the first penalty try, with it leads to the cross kick, where Farrell's trying to get Intermac down, and he's sort of just backwards, and he looks so casual because he's sort of got Farrell sort of with one hand and then sort of out the back pass with the other. I mean, do me a favour. It's just, and I think
a very stylish man.
If I had to sum up most of how France played on Saturday, it probably was do me a favour because some of the stuff was just ridiculous.
Yeah, him and Ramos. We spoke, I think, last week about how Ramos has kind of he's been preferred to Jaminet at fullback for them, and he maybe is a little bit more of a ball player, more of a distributor. But those two in tandem actually take the pressure off Dupont a little bit more. And Itoje, that was part of Itoje's, where I thought Itoje did well, was that he actually, I think without him, Dupont would have just done even more of the stuff he really wanted to do. But because Itoje got to him a few times around the fringes. But those two distributors in tandem certainly kind of, I think, work nicely with Dupont to give him a bit more space.
Charles, just to finish on this England-France section, and actually to finish on Dupont, because we've sort of talked around him a little bit, is that his best performance, do you think, so far in this already excellent career for France?
It's certainly up there. I think that when France lost at Twickenham during COVID and they scored a very behind closed doors, and they scored a very similar try early on to what they scored to their last try, that glorious backs move on Saturday, I think Dupont might have just been better that day and actually was on the losing side because England came back to win and sort of. There's parallels actually with that game because the England team then did face this sort of French onslaught in a sort of attacking sense, but managed to sort of rally and stick to what they did well and nick a very narrow win, whereas there was just no sign of that happening on Saturday. But yeah, Dupont was phenomenal, obviously, and he is phenomenal. He's dare I say it? I mean, is he better already than the great Sir Gareth Edwards as the greatest scrum half of all time? I mean, he's certainly in that conversation already because I don't think there's anybody who excites as soon as he gets the ball like Dupont in World Rugby at the minute, and in the ultra professional era where the players are quite homogenised, for him to still stick out is mightily impressive. It really is.
I saw him post-match, and Charlie and I are not the tallest of people. He's shorter than us. I was looking at him in his trainers, and I was like, he is, honestly. I was comparing heights when he was in the mix, and I was like, blimey, he's actually shorter than us.
Power to weight, he might have us.
Yeah. But I mean, I was very impressed. Right. Next, we're going to head up to Murrayfield, and Charles, you're going to tell us all about how Ireland, despite a patched together pack and set piece, managed to beat Scotland. Okay, Ireland is still on track for the Grand Slam. All things going well. They seem to be able to cope with any sort of disaster that comes their way. Charles, what did you make of them? This Grand Slam is in the bag, isn't it? England haven't got a chance this week.
I'm not going to quite. That certainly wasn't the tone of Andy Farrell and Johnny Sexton's post-match press conference yesterday in Edinburgh. They know it's going to be a challenge. They know that England won't be as bad as they were on Saturday, and it's a bit of a free hit for Borthwick's England, really. Having said that, they seemed very much up for the challenge. How good were they in the second half? They were magnificent. In the first half, they were pretty good too. But Scotland matched them in that first half. And actually, if Scotland had taken a few of their opportunities in that first half, there was the Van der Merwe break where a magnificent try-saving tackle from Hugo Keenan saved them. And then there was the chance that they had right at the end of the first half where I think it's George Turner was or Stuart Hogg. They combined out wide, and one of them was bundled into touch on the end of half time. I think the killer for Scotland, which is what Gregor Townsend alluded to at half time, was that they'd played a magnificent half of rugby. They'd scored that try that they scored with Hugh Jones at the middle in terms of phase play was probably about as organised and as patient an attacking try that Scotland have scored under Townsend. But the real killer blow was that they'd played so well. They got Ireland on the ropes, and yet they still trailed at half-time after playing what may be their best 40 minutes of rugby under Townsend. They still weren't leading, which psychologically must have been a bit of a hammer blow to them, especially when Ireland in that first half lost Caelan Doris, Ian Henderson and Dan Sheehan all to injury. It felt like the stars were aligning a little bit for Scotland with those 3 Irish losses and the opportunities that they were creating. But then at half-time you did think, oh, God, yeah. I mean, they've played really well, but they're still trailing on the scoreboard, and there will surely be a response from Ireland, and there was.
That's got to be really tough for Scotland in terms of, we've spoken about, I think we've seen progress this year, certainly on last year. That Scotland trip to Cardiff last year still haunts me in terms of not fulfilling potential and kind of, not backing up a big win. I feel like we've seen enough in the first 3 games to sort of feel that they were making progress. This will hurt. This will hurt just because of the way, like Charles said, they sort of had Ireland sort of in a bit of a grip. But I think also they'll be frustrated because, no disrespect to the reigning Men's World Player of the Year, Josh van der Fleer, but if you have a flanker throwing in at the line-out, you would think that you might try and apply all of your pressure to said line-out and try and cause Ireland more disruption. Charles, why didn't that happen?
I'm not really too sure, to be honest. And actually, Gregor Townsend, after the match, admitted that was an error. I think Van der Fleer throwing in was 5 from 7. Scotland got to his throwing for the final 2 lineouts, but the game was gone by then. Scotland did suffer a bit of disruption themselves in that area. Richie Gray went off after 6 minutes, and Scott Cummings came on for his first international. It was his first international appearance of the season, so maybe there was a little bit of rustiness there. I'm not sure, but it was certainly a little bit naive and a little bit foolish of Scotland, and actually a bit of a microcosm of the second half, in that they were maybe just a second or a metre off the pace. They didn't score a point in that second half. And Ireland scored 14 unanswered points. The line-out was certainly an issue. But to be honest, the line-out was an issue for Scotland all game. Ireland had that try ruled out early on that was, I think from reading the laws and the knowledge of the laws that I have, I think it was the correct decision. But blimey, they were fortunate, Scotland. It was a technicality, and Scotland were fortunate there. Ireland were unhappy after the match. Andy Farrell, Johnny Sexton were completely at a loss to explain it, and were evidently displeased with the decision to disallow that try. And you do wonder if that might have been blown up into more of a thing had Scotland taken some of their chances and won that game, because Farrell and Sexton were not happy as it was, and they still won by 15 points. So if they'd have lost, God only knows what the reaction would have been.
Yeah, certainly. Glad to hear that Gary Ringrose is all right, because that looked quite nasty when he went off.
Is Russell all right? Limped off, didn't he?
Yeah, there was no mention afterwards that Russell was anything serious, but I guess we wait and see. He was replaced by Chris Harris late on. You don't know if that was precautionary, though. Maybe it was a bit of cramp because the game was gone by then. It was in the 80th minute that he was replaced. On the injuries, Caelan Doris, Ireland are hopeful for the England game next Saturday. Ronan Kelleher, they're not sure about. Ian Henderson is almost definitely a no because he was in a sling last night. Ditto Gary Ringrose. So they're going to be missing. They're going to be missing a few, but they hopefully will have some bodies to come back. I think Dan Sheehan as well was a bit up in the air, but certainly Henderson and Ringrose are almost definitely not going to be playing against England.
I think I read that Ronan Kelleher as well is shut down, as Andy Farrell put it, because he did the same shoulder that he did against France last year, I want to say.
Yeah, so it was the same shoulder. Yeah, absolutely. And he said it's the same feet. It's a strange injury, he said. I don't know, Farrell was a little bit sort of ambiguous with his answer to that one. He didn't really say if he would be fit or not, but he did say it was a repeat of the same injury he did against France last year. But obviously he played on for a bit with it. He just didn't throw in at the line out. He went back out after half time, played on for a bit, and then basically at the first line out or first scrum, I can't remember what it was, Cian Healy came on and hooked, and then Josh van der Fleer had to throw in from the open side.
So Eddie Jones kept talking about adaptability, didn't he? That was the word that he really smashed into every press session that he possibly could, and how that's where England had to get to. That's what impressed me the most, was that Ireland were scrummaging with 3 props. They were throwing in with somebody who's obviously only done that on a very part-time basis and only on training, yet with those platforms really compromised, they were still... Their phase play is so good, they're so intelligent around the other areas of the game that they're able to get through that. England, you hold a mirror up to where England are. England spend the last quarter of their game against France, and the circumstances are different. It's teeming with rain, they're chasing a game, and obviously they haven't had this 3-year build-up to where they are at the minute like Ireland have, but they had four front rows on the pitch and a back row covering the back line, and you can just see how much that can scramble teams. So I think that almost highlighted again, or accentuated, how well Ireland are doing and what a good place they're in. And I think that's why when Andy Farrell's talking about it being one of the best wins of his career, or the best, that's what he means. That's the manna from heaven, isn't it, from coaches, that players are able to problem solve on the pitch. And that's really, really impressive given the pressure they would have been under. And we talk about, sides potentially having a bit of neurosis when so much is on the line, when that Grand Slam is on the line. They came through that so impressively.
I mean, a funky thought. Will teams look at the example of Ireland and copy that? And I mean, because if anything, the Irish scrum improved with Cian Healy at hooker. They won a couple of scrum penalties, I think, and dominated on their own ball and put Scotland under huge pressure. Van der Fleer's arrows were amazing. Will more teams train an open side to chuck in and play 3 props in the front row? I don't know. I mean, it's amazing that it's taken that to sort of blow it all wide open, because it works so successfully.
It was a good move on the ESPN fantasy games. 3 hookers, wasn't it? Because you get
yeah.
So who knows?
Eddie Jones was desperately searching for a prop who could play both sides, wasn't he? When they came back from Australia,
when we saw him last,
where we saw us, but it's actually, this is what he really needs. Just a final note on this game before we chat about things in Rome. The Caelan Doris injury is quite interesting. Hopefully he will play next week, but it almost throws the player of the championship race kind of a little bit open. That's back-to-back player of the match awards from Matt Canson, I think, because he was player of the match last week as well, or he has been at least once before in this tournament.
Italy, yeah.
I noticed he didn't swear in this post-match interview. Is he coming to the mix? Maybe. Basically what I'm trying to ask is who is Ireland's sort of out-and-out best player?
Boringly, Josh van der Fleer.
I don't think that's boring. I'm just curious because there's so many candidates.
James Ryan, I'd have right
James
up there.
Ryan was awesome yesterday.
A really good player.
Jeremy behind the glasses told me Hugo Keenan, which actually
it's like Van der Fleer isn't boringly good all the time. So let's give it James Ryan so far. But I mean, it's a big step to get past England. England will be better. So can we wait? Don't have to name it after 4 games, do we?
No, I'm just curious. I just like the idea. I had Doris sort of almost inked in after the first 3 rounds, but I mean, here we are. Okay, let's jump to Rome, and one team finally managed to get a win, but it wasn't the favourites. The Warren Gatland second era is up and running after getting a victory over Italy, 29-17. Wales sort of dominating on the scoreboard for long periods. Charles, if I come to you first, you actually were the most tentative of all of us when we were talking about Italy being favourites for this and how they might perform and whether they would handle the pressure. And I think Charlie and I were probably more, finally they're going to be okay. And you were saying, I don't know. And you were right. So congratulations. Tell us how that feels.
Thank you. Well, there's a first time for everything.
What did you watching it just feel as though Italy lacked the control that was required? Were they just too loose? Did they get too did they want to throw the ball about and entertain a bumper crowd? I think someone said about 60,000 at the Olimpico, which is awesome. I'm really glad about that.
Yeah, it looked a really good travelling Welsh support. It looked a much bigger crowd than when I was there for France v Italy in the first round. Italy were really poor first half an hour. Sort of, to be honest, you could probably say first half. Wales exploited Tommy Allen at fullback. Obviously, Italy were missing Onji Capuozzo, and they picked Allen, who's normally a fly half at fullback, and Wales did exploit that and made him look a little bit silly at times. Having said that, he wasn't on his own, and you can't lay Italy's poor first half entirely at his feet. Having said that, I thought they had a very, very valid case for a penalty try when Brex went over and was caught by Owen Williams as the fly half was tracking back, and then Brex knocked on over the line. Owen Williams was in an offside position, Brex over the tackle playing the ball, so the offside line was made. Bizarrely, the officials were talking about whether there was a ruck or not, but you don't need a ruck anymore for an offside line to come into play. A tackle line is enough. It was disappointing, but at least I suppose that the silver lining for Italy is they did stay in the fight. They improved in the second half. They scored some good tries. It wasn't a hammering. And maybe a couple of decisions either way, each way, because after that penalty try was not awarded, Wales kicked a goal line dropout that was dropped, and Italy had a player in front, and Owen Williams kicks 3 points. So that's a 10-point swing, potentially with a yellow card in a click of a fingers. That's a massive moment in the game in terms of the momentum of the game. I still think there are positives for Italy, though. They still attack beautifully, especially out wide. There was one first phase strike move early on in the first half that cut Wales to ribbons. The Welsh midfield defence was at 6s and 7s. There were dummy runners everywhere. Everybody singing off the same song sheet, and it was very, very easy on the eye, and it worked beautifully. It was wonderfully incisive, and more of that. And they could cause Scotland problems, especially if that second half. If that second half for Scotland at Murrayfield yesterday does a bit of psychological damage to them in that how sort of poor they were really in that second half, Italy could go and ruffle some feathers in Edinburgh next weekend. Certainly,
I was just going to say, now that they've sort of not won the game that we expected them to potentially win, they might actually now go to Murrayfield when maybe people are writing them off against a resurgent Scotland and actually pull off a bit of a shock.
Well, again, it's a bit like England, really. They've got little to lose. It's almost a free hit.
Yeah, no, it is, to be fair. Loved Negri's try, actually. His pickup was very impressive for such a big man. Let's talk about Wales and Rhys Webb again. I just want to come back to him. First Six Nations start in 6 years. So proper sort of in the wilderness stint, kind of coming back to this point. Great control of the game, great sort of faith in him from Gatland to deliver that kind of performance, and he really glued everything together for Wales quite well, didn't he, Charlie? I mean, we've talked about how Wales are just trying stuff, aren't they, in this tournament? Like they're seeing if that centre partnership works or that back row works, and actually the whole focus coming into this game was trying to slow down Italy's ball at the breakdown and possession. Well, actually, Italy just gave them the ball back through turnover, so that was less of an issue. But Webb sort of controlled things quite well.
Yeah, definitely. Ross Petty's done some work on this on Twitter. I think that Gatland is kind of sticking with combinations and moving those combinations around. So obviously Rhys Webb and Owen Williams coming together as a package, and yeah, that was good. It was refreshing, as you say, and Italy, I said a couple of times, really wanted Italy to stay true to themselves and not clam up. It was almost like they stayed true to themselves, but just weren't as good as what they had been doing. Running out of their own, running exits, just weren't as precise. And they didn't do what England did against Wales, which was just absolutely not bother with playing with the ball anywhere near kind of their own 22. They did the opposite and kind of came a cropper a bit, but. Yeah, I agree with the pressure off at Murrayfield. Just hope they give it a lash again. Either way, again, we come back to it. It's a better championship when you're thinking, I'll sit down and watch this Italy game, and I'm sure we'll be entertained and interested by it.
It's going to be the best wooden spoon ever, is what you're telling me. If
That's
they lose
the golden spoon.
We're going to look back on it fondly. The golden spoon, no.
gold-plated wooden spoon.
Very, very finally, Charles. Just very quickly, Wales in Paris. What do you reckon? Can they? No chance. Was that what you were going to say?
No chance.
Really?
Chance. I honestly think there's more chance of England winning in Dublin.
Okay. Well, that actually says it all.
I can hear people giggling in the background there.
The whole office actually heard that. They're all cackling. Just a quick shout out to the clever journalists who sensibly have stayed with the Welsh camp in Nice this week before they play France in Paris, having been in Italy last week. Love your work. Yeah. Really respect it.
We're not jealous at all.
Really respect it. Okay, we're going to now have a look ahead to Ireland against England. One team is certainly the favourite for that. Okay, England against Ireland this weekend. England trying to restore a bit of pride after a pretty desperate performance. Charlie, if I come to you first, how many changes do you think we'll make? Because it's quite a tricky one, isn't it? Because there's a case for dropping about 5 or 6 or 7 players, but that just leads to total chaos. So who do you think potentially could, just if we talk about the team as a whole for certain positions, like fly half, which we're going to chat about a bit more, who could potentially come into the side, Charlie, do you think?
One forced change, haven't we? Ollie Lawrence out with the hamstring. Manu Tuilagi is with quite nice, helpful timing. His suspension has elapsed and he's been in for the last 2 weeks, which is hopefully going to prove pretty handy for Steve Borthwick. I don't know whether they want to reconfigure the pack and Johnny Hill's return to the training squad has something to do with that. So maybe one of potentially Chesson drops to the back row. There are whispers, as I say, that Ludlam was going to be at 8 instead of Dombrandt before Courtney Lawes' injury. So there are those options there. I see the mid and shock. We're looking back at the midfield, aren't we? But so there are a couple of combinations that you can either go obviously with 2 distributors, whether that's Smith and Farrell or Ford and Farrell and Tuilagi at 13, or one of the best performances that they've had in Dublin in living memory was 2019 when they went Farrell, Tuilagi, Slade. So I would say it would probably be up to how much continuity that they can keep and whether they see Manu Tuilagi as a 12 or as a 13. I would have thought they'd see him as a 12, to be honest, just because of the way it seemed to be, the way that the squads have been shaping up, and the fact that Marchant played 13 in that first game, and then they went with Lawrence and Slade. But Slade, that'd mean keeping Slade, and Slade was one of the quieter players, obviously replaced around 45-ish minutes, I think, by Farrell.
Yeah.
And Farrell immediately, as I said earlier, immediately just brought that direction, brought that organisation. So you wonder whether you fear for Henry Slade on the back of that. He's the guy that drops out, and they go with and what we said after on the very first pod, I think, after the Scotland game, or the second one, was that Smith and Farrell do at least have a little bit of existing cohesion going into this game, or recent cohesion from the tests that they've played together. So maybe that gives them a little bit. But Henshaw came off the bench, didn't he, for Ireland? He's back, and even though they don't have Ringrose, Ireland, they're going to have a pretty hefty dynamic midfield, which is going to really test England there.
Charles, it seems kind of bringing Tuilagi straight back in and Johnny Hill straight back in would seem like a bit of a lurch, given they haven't played. And I appreciate Tuilagi's been banned, but given there's been a bit of continuity, and it's like, okay, let's just bring back in a couple of heavy guys. But actually, is that what they need? Like, how do you add more power into this side without completely disrupting it?
Yeah, it's a good question, because there's a number of those English forwards who really are going to be in the team this weekend because there isn't a better option. Not necessarily because they're deserving of their place after last weekend. The back row was completely outplayed in all areas at every minute of the match. I think Jamie George and Carl Sinclair as well have not had their finest tournaments, and if there were better options, then they would be looking over their shoulders as well. The thing about bringing Johnny Hill back in, could he be looking at Maritoje at 6?
That was my thought. Yeah,
obviously the line out is so crucial against Ireland, and actually the line out didn't go so well against France either. Could he be looking at Marrow at 6, having 2 lumps, Chesham and Hill in the second row to get more power in the scrum? And Johnny Hill, of course, is an excellent maul forward. That's probably his forte. Could he be looking at Itoje at 6 with maybe Ludlam at 8 and Willis at 7, because, I mean, Itoje, for all of his strengths, and he was one of the shining lights for England on Saturday, he doesn't really play that much like a sort of traditional lock forward. He does play more of a 6, really. He is more of a sort of lock 6 hybrid. So I wonder whether he's looking at that, and maybe for this weekend, Itoje at 6 with the absence of Courtney Laws, and Willis at 7, and Jack Willis was uncharacteristically quiet against France. In fact, that's probably the quietest game I've ever seen him play, either for Wasps, Toulouse, or England.
Is that Toulouse players doing their homework, do you think? I mean, there were 8 of them in the starting 15 or something ridiculous? Do you think they were just, knew how to shut him down?
Perhaps, but I just think it's also just very difficult as a jackler. It's very difficult to get your hands on the ball at the jackal if your team is constantly on the back foot and reeling, and the opposition are playing at such pace and offload. Also, if France offload more than any other side, so if you're offloading loads and the ball is off the floor, then how is the jackler going to win it? They're not. And it was telling that Willis's effect on the game was minimal. In terms of just and behind, are we all sort of in agreement that Farrell has to come back in?
Well,
is that sort of in some guys either at 10 or 12?
I would say so.
It's good you've brought that up, because we need to have a chat about who's going to start at fly half. So I think this is probably the time to do it. We've had Smith, we've had Farrell. Steve Borthwick, when we were at Penny Hill last week, had an interesting quote about George Ford. He said George Ford's going back for more game time, and that he'd been tearing it up in training, and we're very lucky to have 3 world-class fly halves, which I thought was quite interesting. So if that is the case, Charlie, I'll come to you first. Who is your starting 10 in Dublin this Saturday?
Oh, can I give you 2 options? I think if they go 10-12, I think they go Smith Farrell, just because of the unknown factor. I think it's just such a monster game to bring back forward 4. And I think you've just got that little bit of momentum with how Smith and Farrell have at least played together for a little bit. I agree that Farrell needs to be on pitch in some guys, and I think that probably should be at 10. And for me, that'd mean Tuilagi Slade, although I was really low on how Slade went. And then we're looking further in the back line as well. I think with Farrell at 10, he likes Malins at 14, and I think Malins might be under threat from his place from someone like Henry Arundel. So what I'm telling you, Ben, is I'm really struggling to work this out in my head. I got asked this at full time, and just went, I have to be on the fence on that. I would have to. This is why they get paid the big bucks. That they've just got to have some sort of thought process to go through to get an answer to this.
Is it a bit wasteful to have all 3 in the 23?
Yeah, I think so. Yeah, so definitely. Especially when you've got someone like Slade, who, even if you do go 2 distributors, Slade has got that little bit of history, albeit a little bit of history covering the back 3 as well, because he's so versatile. So, but geez, I was so low on how Slade played on Saturday, just from the lack of organisation outside Smith. Smith kind of likes to play fast and likes to play maybe to break out of structure, but England's structure, things lack of structure let them down. That was what helped France to absolutely wreak havoc at the breakdown, was that they were overcommitting and undercommitting, and as soon as Farrell came on for the small window that he had had as many backs as he'd like, you saw that there was that little bit more precision and accuracy, and that's what we're gonna need in Dublin.
Charles, who's your fly half?
Of course. I mean, I'm tempted by Farrell at fly half, just simply because of the amount of centre options that Steve Borthwick has called into the squad. Obviously, Guy Porter of Leicester's been recalled. Joe Marchant's also there. There's Manu Tuilagi. There's Henry Slade, and Henry Slade was poor, as Charlie's touched on, against France. But I do think Borthwick could do a lot worse than pick George Ford at fly half, potentially with Farrell at 12, and maybe with Marchant or Manu at 13. And it's going to be rainy in Dublin. The forecast is terrible. I mean, he could do far worse than pick George Ford in his spiral bombs. It's going to be an evening kickoff. It's going to be dark. It's going to be rainy. It's going to be floodlights. England could just go there with nothing to lose and just try and stop Ireland playing, just try and make a mess of it all, and see if that gets them, over the line. I think what is very telling, Colsey, you've mentioned this already. What is very telling was that first. England got the free kick at that. Is it the first scrum that they got a free kick against France? Marcus Smith attempted a spiral bomb off that free kick. So that is clearly something that they've worked on. We haven't seen him do it that often successfully in an England shirt. So, certainly not to the level of success that George Ford executed that skill with Leicester. And it didn't work. He kicked it far too long. It was, and Thomas Ramos lapped it up. He was very, very annoyed with himself, Marcus Smith, and that was the last time it happened in the entire game. So it is clearly something that they are looking to exploit, and there is no better exponent of it than George Ford. Is he ready? That's the big question. Is he ready? I'm not sure, but I do think he could do worse than pick Ford at 10 and just say, right, we're going to go there and we're going to be a bit boring and we're going to be a bit conservative. But you know what? If they went there and they were boring and they were conservative and they won 15-12, no one would care.
You could just go Ford, Farrell, Slade and just kick everything, couldn't you? I mean,
well, there is that.
I think, I'm not entirely sold on bringing back Manitou Alagi. I'm not sold on Slade, especially after the way he played on the weekend. It feels a bit soon for Ford. I feel like Smith needs another go.
How did he go for Sale?
I think fine. I mean, they lost, but they got back into the game. But I think fine. But I think they might end up back with Farrell at 10, just because of convenience. Very quickly to wrap up, because we're out of time. Can we just get Ireland going to win a Grand Slam? Yes, 3 yeses. Charlie,
big yes.
Charlie, big yes. Charles,
yes.
And I will say comprehensive yes as well. Okay, let's finish up today by hearing some of your readers' questions. We're going to start with one, I think, from Will Hobbs, just relating to England, where he says, does this show that any players in particular are out of their depth at this level? It seems as if most England fans were buzzing with the lineup pre-game. I mean that is true. There was certainly quite a lot of enthusiasm for the team that was named, and sort of just to see what it was capable of. What do you think, Charlie?
Well, the names that spring to mind straight away. This is super cruel, isn't it? But I thought Don Brandt had a tough day, and we flagged from the start that he was a really interesting selection at 8 for a couple of reasons. One, you're passing over someone like Billy Vunipola, who's been there and done that in favour of a really different number 8, a skillful, dexterous player. Not that Billy isn't skillful and dexterous, he is, but you know what I mean, sort of a more focus on the footballing side of it. He's totally overlooked Sam Simmons, no game time and now away, out of the squad for this last game. We know that Zach Mercer's coming back. We know that he's fond of Tom Willis. And I thought Alex Donbrandt was good. He's had such a funny tournament, just good in patches and then some mistakes, and then also some times where maybe the pace of things has overwhelmed him. Maybe is that fair to say? I'm not sure. Yeah. It's such a difficult conversation. He would be one name. Then I think Henry Slade had as we said earlier in the podcast, I think Henry Slade had a difficult day. I would have expected more out of him as an organising force outside of Marcus Smith, especially. Those are the two, and that's kind of the jarring thing is that there aren't many. You can't go into the Premiership, and there aren't many that you're picking out going, that's going to really elevate it. Yeah. Maybe someone like, if we flip the question on its head a bit, who would you bring in? Someone like George Martin. I think it's going to be a matter of time before he gets a look at this level. Just defensive stopping power, looks a lot more mobile in attack as well. But that's the kind of one of the more worrying things about this, is that you're not going, well, bin him and get him in, because I don't mind most of this Borthwick selection.
That's the thing. Also, such a fine line between being out of your depth and not being up to the standard of Test rugby, and actually just playing really poorly. And I think that's the problem coming out of this game.
While you're bedding into a new style and under a new coach,
you've got raw players trying to bed in, and you've got experienced players not playing well, and who, if you get rid of, then you are starting again with a new player. I mean, we've sort of spoken about, in terms of players who would come back. I mean, Tom Curry would come back into that team, and Courtney Lawes would come back into that team as well. But if you're thinking about players who are potentially never going to get capped again, pretty much everyone in that squad has a realistic chance because the well isn't very deep. I mean, George Martin's one. Tom Pearson's another one who we keep sort of watching for Northern Irish and thinking, with his ability to, not just his jackling ability, which is very good and he's a good defender, but he's added to his carrying. Like, he's a better ball carrier now than he was a season ago. He makes those line breaks, really comfortable on the ball, runs hard. He set up London Irish's bonus point try against Sale with another sort of break and offload, and that's not the first time he's done it this season. But again, you're running on not a lot of time here ahead of the World Cup to try out these players and see what's happened, and you've already had 4 games to get a look, and that opportunity's gone. So players that are actually out of their depth, the only one I think who would come into the conversation is probably Don Brand, but even then he's had good moments in this tournament.
Yeah, and maybe if you're looking at somebody that could be cast aside after this, maybe Malins, do you think? But again, he's been good. This is the problem. I thought Lewis Ludlam had some really tough moments, some kind of really avoidable penalties and errors, but he's been one of England's better players this Six Nations. So, it's not going to be... Steve Borthwick is ruthless, don't get me wrong. We've seen that from how he operated at Leicester, but I don't think this is a Japan 2018 black hole game, just because I think that it was a perfect storm of things.
Just such a weird season for Malins, because obviously he sort of got left out in the autumn. Sounds like he was made a bit of a scapegoat by by Eddie Jones and the England coaching staff. Came back in, played well against Scotland, has played sort of well up until Saturday, when positionally he was part of the problems that England seemed to have in the backfield, in terms of they just weren't covering space well enough, and you can't really put any blame on him for not getting that crossfield kick for the try, because it was such a hard chance. It's not that, it's the different aspects of the game, and you wonder whether someone else is better suited there. So it's an interesting question, mainly because it's very hard to come up with a clear answer. Another question we had from Dr. Malcolm Harvey, which was, if England are down by 3 against Ireland next week with the clock in the red, do you kick a goal and take a draw to deny Ireland the Grand Slam, or do you go for the win?
Love this question.
Great question. My instinct would be, I reckon they are petty enough to kick the 3 and deny them the slam. 100%. I think. Also, maybe this
draw in Ireland is a really...
especially against this Ireland, yeah. I don't actually know. Also,
how good though.
I don't know if I trust them to go for the win and to try and execute it. Maybe I'm still thinking about the
imagine the celebrations game as well, though, because would it be like a maul turnover and just scenes to win the Grand Slam?
Such a salty
Peter O'Mahony
post-match dinner well.
It's Peter O'Mahony telling the story about his maul turnover forever or something.
Very good question. You want to will this into existence? Yeah, that would make for. I just like the idea of this, because it means we get a slightly competitive game in Dublin, and I'm not expecting it. I'm not expecting it. Not expecting it at all. A couple more questions. Is Antoine Dupont the greatest scrum half to have ever played? I think not yet. But I think but it's a good
that was so dismissive. The start of that was great,
because I was suddenly thinking about who I rank above him, and I know Charles mentioned Gareth Edwards earlier. He was a really obvious go-to. If I'm thinking about great scrum halves sort of my lifetime, I'm thinking about Huey de Prier and kind of people like that, and Jules van der Vestes, and I don't know. I think he's in the conversation.
Do you know he is such a different scrum half to someone like Aaron Smith. And when Aaron Smith is playing phenomenally well,
I love Aaron Smith. Yeah,
right. Different sort of scrum half. He's fizzing away passes. He's dinking little kicks into space. He's not necessarily making the explosive. He's like a boxer, Dupont, isn't he? Like he'll bob and weave around a breakdown, get rid of her forward and offload it, and then set France or Toulouse away. In that respect, he's probably slightly different. So he's a sort of, as far as a general rugby player, he's one of the best I've ever seen for sure. And then moments like the 50-22, they do take your breath away. They really are. And there was a chip and chase as well, just beyond the hour mark, I think, off a little Farrell grubber, and Tamak fielded it. Dupont did amazingly to get himself back in position to take the pass in the first place, but then just ignited a counter as only he can.
And just to move on to an interesting question, this from Paul, actually. So I think this is going to become an issue, actually, over the next few months, in terms of, should the RFU be allowed to select players from clubs outside of England? the Premiership is clearly not producing world-class players anymore. So logistically, this has always been a nightmare for England because it's meant they've had limited access or less access to their players. And it's been interesting watching Jack Willis in this tournament because he's been the first player, did we say since Tom Palmer for Stade Francais about 10 years ago? Was that who we said? Charlie's.
I was a hell of a shout. No, I can remember the question coming up and remember thinking, don't know. I went to Wilkinson denied too long, but I think there have been a couple subsequently.
Basically, it's been a while, and so it's been quite interesting to see it in action again with Willis going back. He went back and played half an hour for Toulouse, didn't he, the other week? He went back in the first week, and I think first Fowler week, and just didn't play actually.
Well, they didn't want him to. I asked Kevin Sinfield. I said, look, because he was retained obviously on the Tuesday leading into France. I said, what's changed? And he just went, well, time around it, and also I think how well he's gone.
If you're being cynical about it, he went back to play for Toulouse a couple of Sundays ago. Was great, had a telling impact, helped with match-winning turnovers in a win over Racing, and then came back to join the England squad, and then didn't play well for England against France. So you would argue that it doesn't work.
Yeah, off the back of a 6-day turnaround. But would the RFU, as part of the new PGA, be fighting for more access to say you can't go back for those, or what? Would they have a leg to stand on in those situations? Probably not, because guys like Finn Russell have to go back, and now we're seeing him limp out of games. So it's really difficult.
The last point of that question, I do think is quite interesting in terms of the Premiership not producing enough world-class players anymore. You are letting players go and play in a league with sort of, I'm not going to say an across-the-board better standard of players, but certainly very different, and that is only going to help with their development. And I think we've seen that from Willis actually when we were chatting to his teammate Francois Crowe after the game. Like Crowe was saying that he's been a great addition and that he's been playing really well. You can see how a player benefits from that move.
Who was the last world-class player that the Premiership produced?
Oh man,
I mean, Freddie Stewart's going all right?
Yeah,
and that you look at. I think you have to take it club by club, and you have to take it. You have to take it as far as what sort of rugby that club is playing. Probably helps. I remember Eddie Jones when he took all of those Leicester Tigers youngsters on tour to Australia. He said they're playing Test match rugby, so I know that Steve Borthwick's coaching them, and therefore they're going to be more ready. I don't think you'd have many qualms with the guys coming through at Saracens when they did. That was so when a club gets its academy in order and is playing, good rugby, and there's that link there. I don't think we could say that the Premiership isn't producing those world-class players, but maybe not doing it with regularity as they used to when the age grade system was, seemed to be more joined up. That's another problem that is issue that seems to need to be fixed, because countries like Ireland, France, even Italy, there's just more alignment there, and that would certainly help alongside. It can only help as far as developing players for Test matches.
Sorry, Paul, we probably need to get that about half an hour.
Yeah, we do.
To answer it
we
properly.
do. I saw that come up. It's great to get our teeth into that at some stage.
Well, just a final point I would say is that moving to France worked out quite well for Zach Mercer. So
we don't know yet.
It sort of shows that
he's the kind of the great white hope, isn't he? But who knows? That's he's going well. You're right.
That's it for today, everybody. Thank you to Charlie and to Charles, as always. One more round to go then in the Six Nations, with Ireland chasing that Grand Slam. Can they secure it on home soil? Come back on next Monday and we will have a recap of all of the final day of the Six Nations and look back on the tournament as a whole and all the highlights. In the meantime, please keep up with everything on the Telegraph website. There's going to be plenty of analysis throughout the week, and please also subscribe to the podcast wherever you are listening to it. See you next week. Bye-bye.